So welcome everyone to today's seminar. I'll start as we always do by acknowledging and celebrating the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose unceded traditional lands we're meeting today, and pay our respects to the community's elders, past, present and emerging. And we're delighted to have as our speaker today palaeoecologist Simon Haberle. Simon's a homegrown ANU product, did both his undergraduate degree here and then his PhD on the vegetation history of the Tari Basin in the Southern Highlands of PNG. And since then, he's branched out to do fieldwork in most corners of the tropical or subtropical world. And if you haven't seen him before, that's why. He's worked in South America, in the Amazon Basin, in China, in most of the remote islands of the Indian Ocean, as well, of course, as in Australia and across the Pacific Islands. Locally, he's perhaps best known for his work on the ACT pollen count, which is just one of his many projects that are designed to bring his work to bear on sort of contemporary social issues and make his research digitally available to a broader public. He's also one of the chief investigators of the ARC Centre of Excellence of Australian Biodiversity and Heritage, as well as the ECDI project, the Evolution of Cultural Diversity Initiative, of which Synapse forms a part. And in his spare time, he's director of the School of Culture, History and Language. So he'll be speaking today about some of the broader implications of his work for our understanding of past and present landscapes. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris, for that. And Chris and I, of course, go a long way back too, also homegrown. I think you say yourself, Chris. We did our PhDs, basically contemporary time up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and a really formative time for much of the thinking that goes into today's talk, really. And yeah, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land we meet, and to all the people out there who are on other traditional lands. I'd just like to pay respects and acknowledge those lands and the traditional owners as well, and for elders past, present and emerging. Yeah, and I'd also like to shout out to my mum and dad, who I think are, that's one of the joys of these Zoom meetings, that you get all manner of people turning up, and it's wonderful to have them on board. And I don't think they get to hear, thankfully, much of this work that I'm talking about and so on. But yeah, it's really good that we can actually reach a really broad audience. And yeah, it's also wonderful to have people sitting here in the audience. This is, like we say, the first time that that's happened for a while for many of us. So I'm hoping this will be a trajectory in the right direction towards more of us being able to meet together and work together. And more broadly, I've acknowledged some key, I guess, funders at the bottom there, particularly the Centre of Excellence and the ANU, CHL, ARC has been a really fundamental part of the work I do. But even more fundamental than that are the many communities that I've been able to work with and work for over the last 30 years or so in this business. But it is only possible and has been made possible through the kind of collaboration, insights, and the really generous gifting of being able to work on land that is, wherever you are, belongs to an Indigenous community in the areas that I'm involved with. So that's been a real privilege, and we'll talk more about that as we go. The topic, reading landscapes, is kind of another way of trying to describe the kind of work that I do. In many ways, many of us who work in this kind of reconstruction of what environments were like in the past, whether it's archaeological, paleoecological, historical, and so on, often spend a lot of time sitting on our backsides and looking out a window or out at a landscape or out at a scene and trying to perhaps contemplate and understand how that place has come about, whether it's in the short time frame or the very long time frame. And we, in the sort of paleoecological realm, deal with a whole range of time frames. And we'll cover some of those today. And I really want to focus in on some of the new work that we're doing here at ANU and collaborating with communities around Australia, New Guinea, in particular. That's where the focus will be, and to give you a sense really of what that reading of landscapes is like, what it can reveal, and hopefully what it can generate in terms of new ideas and the kind of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work that we are trying to really engage with here in the ECDI and in CHL and at the ANU. So just a bit of a kind of broad sweep of some of the ideas that go towards what I'm doing and others in this field are doing, and many of it harks back to many decades and centuries even of thinking, but certainly this work of Glacken in many ways is a turning point or a tipping point of a geographer, historical geographer, who's thinking deeply about the nature of human agency on the land and what role humans play, whether it's directly or potentially the transformations that are perhaps unseen or often remote and unintended. We'll talk a little bit more about those as well. And these are the kind of areas that we're particularly interested in focusing on. And some of the work we do in this particular field is certainly not just remote in space, in places that are perhaps far flung from urban environments, but also remote in time. So we're dealing with this long time frame of study as well. And I'll introduce you to some of the ways we do that. But also coming a bit further towards the present, people like Pat Kirch, archaeologists who work across the Pacific in particular, have written a lot about this notion that humans have been environment transforming species. So, a really key part of this kind of relentless change that has occurred. And in many cases, we trace this back into the Pleistocene, back into tens of thousands of years ago. In this sort of more recent period, the period of the Holocene, the warm climates, wet, warm climates that we experience today, relative to the Pleistocene, we see the emergence of this domestication of plants and animals and so on, and the impacts that has had across landscapes and the rise of urbanism to such an extent that virtually no part of the planet remains untouched or remained pristine, as it were. So this notion of pristine is really contested, I think, and one that we'll talk a little bit about as we go through as well. And even more recently, a really wonderful researcher who I've worked with many times in the past, Leslie Head of geography down at University of Melbourne, now becoming the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. I think that's one of the changes happening, but she's been seminal sort of thinking about what does it really mean to have human agency and human impacts and human relations with the environment in many cases, and thinking deeply about this and deeply about the relationship between humans and how they're embedded in the Earth's surface in such intimate ways as we move into this time of climate change and the Anthropocene. So this kind of writings that Leslie has done over the last decade or so have been really, I think, transformative in many ways about placing particularly Australia's thinking in the terms of how people have impacted nature and the fact that nature is neither stable nor pristine. So we'll see that demonstrated in some of the work that I'm going to show you in the next little while. But I think a lot of emphasis is when you're looking at the past, you're thinking about the climates, whether they're colder, hotter, wetter, drier, sea levels fall and rise, and you get change going on at the pace of the sort of geological timescale. But humans, have really been key in this sort of Australian ecosystem for tens of thousands of years, and through we're learning so much more about that now, and so many more voices are coming to that debate. But it makes it a really exciting and important place to have these kind of debates of how Australia has transformed over this deep time frame. And those voices that we start to see in the last decade or so, people like Bruce Pascoe, or to begin with, Bill Gammage, I guess, putting out that book about the biggest estate on Earth, this notion of almost, again, most parts of Australia being managed and influenced by human agency or long settlement and management of by Aboriginal land managers over this long time frame, and then Bruce coming into the picture with Dark Emu and essentially rewriting a lot of the thinking and challenging a lot of thinking about how we describe the kind of land use and land management processes that exist in Australia, and how potentially agriculture is such a long-term feature in this environment. So how do we, that gives you a sense of some of the kind of changes in thinking and so on that's gone on over the last couple of decades, certainly since I started a PhD and finished back in the early 1990s. Much has changed, and our approach to things has changed as well, I hope for the better. And one of the ways of reading these landscapes, and I want to give you a sense of how we go about our work in palaeoecology, and we're very fortunate here in ANU to have a long history of that kind of work. Donald Walker and Gurdeep Singh and others foundation kind of researchers in setting up this, what is still the lab up in the Coombs building, where we can engage in the kind of reading landscapes through stratigraphic sections, if you like, looking at these stratigraphies in lakes and swamps that preserve so well the past environment in snapshots of fossil remains or isotopic variability or other things that might reveal what that particular environment was like in the past. And so we do this kind of dating. We collaborate with radiocarbon, lead-210, other kind of dating techniques to build a chronology from the kind of sediments that we gather in the field. We can take those, identify changes in things like fire regimes, if we're interested in the question of how fire has changed through time, looking at the charcoal particles preserved, quantifying them. And there's a lot of really new and interesting research emerging, people like Janelle Stevenson and Vicky Miller and others in our lab, looking at really refining, trying to refine the way that we quantify, but also potentially examine the temperature at which these charcoal particles were burnt, so that we can get at the question of how hot these fires were in the past. All these things are possible, and we're exploring those options through the kind of research we're able to do through collaboration in the lab. And this is particularly a key feature in the Australian landscape in particular, where fire is such an important component. And the heat and intensity of fire is such a, in many ways, a menacing part of the environment that we've all too frequently or very frequently experienced, particularly here in the Southeast Australian region. The other things we can use to read the landscape of these tiny fossils that we find, pollen, of course, which is part of my thing, I guess. That's what my expertise is identifying these small biotic remains preserved in the sediments, and you can use them to almost fingerprint, if you like, the different environments you might be representing in any sample down through a sediment column. So if it's dominated by rainforest pollen, you're most likely within a rainforest environment. If it's dominated by grassland or woodland pollen, then you know you're in a woodland environment. So it's a very powerful tool and gets you not just these broad categories, but down to the kind of genera and families, and in some cases species that might have existed in the past and being utilised by people potentially. The other great tool that we have to do this work, and we're very fortunate here at ANU to have a long history of collections. It's a really important part of and what I've been trying to support a lot and generate interest in preserving the collections at ANU. And the one particular collection, the Australasian Polar and Spore Atlas, is really key. It's set up back in the 60s, essentially, 1960s, and has been collecting over 16,000 specimens over that time period. We went through a little phase of digitising that reference collection, and we're still ongoing with that work, but hopefully in the next month or so, we'll be able to launch a new website that we've been able to develop in collaboration with the Research School of Physics through Tim Senden and others there, and build this much more accessible online reference collection. And these collections, whether they be pollen, whether they be faunal remains, whether they be other botanic remains, whether they be cultural material and so on, are really critical to not just the research, but also the learning and training that needs to go on for people to actually accomplish this kind of work. And the other curious aspect that I'll talk a little bit more about is this non-pollen palynomorphs. And these are, I'm highlighting here one particular type, which is a dung fungi. And we're doing quite a bit of research, strangely enough, on the remains of dung that we might find in the environment. And this is, you might find that's strange and curious, but essentially we believe these kind of fossil fossil spores that you see there on the right are essentially the remains or a representative of essentially the amount of dung in the environment in the past. If you get more of these, potentially you're looking at more animals producing dung in that environment. And on one panel there, you see the elephant producing its deposit, but of course, you know, if we're in Jurassic Park, you might find ginormous amounts of dung, which is the GIF there is illustrating. But essentially, you could imagine the more dung in the environment, the more of these spores turn up. So this has actually become a really critical and interesting proxy for megafauna, large animals in the environment. And it's been used in places like the US to track mammoth populations, you know, in Africa and other areas to do the elephant and large mammal population, and in other places such as Europe, looking at cattle and so on, the dynamics of cattle herds, using this as a proxy as well, all on the assumption that more of these dung fungi remains equals more poo. So it's, yeah, a curious and different kind of approach, but it's actually very powerful and can tell us a lot about this issue of animals as well as plants. I'll just reduce that a little bit. So I'll start to sort of elucidate some of the research we've done using all these tools and looking at different key time periods in this region, focusing a lot on Sahel, this area of New Guinea and Australia, down to Tasmania. But of course, it has implications for the wider region as well, and globally in many cases. And one of the big debates that has caused a lot of sort of division in many ways across the academic landscape is this notion of what causes this megafauna extinction in Australia, the notion that potentially larger mammals have gone extinct at some point. That's the point at which they go extinct is certainly debated. Dating is very difficult back before about 50,000 years ago. So we are faced with many challenges. One of the beauties of these pollen and charcoal and spore records is that they can be almost continuous through time and go back as far as the sedimentary record allows you to go back. And this is a beautiful site up in Queensland, Lynch's Crater. Sue Rule, who's in the audience, worked on this for a PhD, and Peter Kershaw down at Monash worked on it for many years. But we collaboratively worked on this to look at the dynamics of not just the rainforest and sclerophyll vegetation types over time. And you can see that fluctuating quite dramatically over the last 130,000 years. But looking in detail at the dung fungi, the Sporomyella listed there, next to the grass and charcoal, you start to see that there is a tipping point, if you like, in the dung fungi record around 41,000 years ago, and where we get a decrease, a stepwise decrease in the amount of dung fungi. And this has been related in the literature to this dung fungi decline, perhaps the savanna grasslands expanding, fire regimes being altered, and essentially extinction perhaps of some of the larger mammals, which resulted in a change in the fuel load in the environment and more burning. Essentially, these feedbacks were quite interesting to think about. But essentially, that was, you know, back in 2012. Since then, we've been targeting quite a number of other records, and just a couple of weeks ago, or about a month ago, we published from a very different environment, not the tropics, but off the south coast of South Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin, a marine core that also preserves very well the last 125,000 years or so of vegetation change and dynamics across the more arid part of Australia. And within that, we also use these marine cores to look at the dung fungi. And this gives you a sense of the scale. So this is a much bigger scale. The previous record is a volcanic maar infilled with sediments, quite a local signature. This potentially captures the signature from the whole Murray-Darling Basin. So it's quite a remarkable sedimentary sequence, because it's essentially the Murray River depositing its sediment out across the continental shelf. And we believe that captures that story quite well. And you can see the kind of expected dynamics between here, trees and shrubs, which are mostly eucalyptus, cypress pine and other casuarinas and so on, and the grasses, the herbs and daisies being represented in the orange. And over this time of 125,000 years ago, going from warm to cold periods, you see during that cold period of from about 70,000 years to 10,000 years is the including the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, when you get the expanse of grasslands in that system. So it's telling the story of that basin's vegetation change relative to climate change over those thousands of years of history. We also counted the dung fungi, of course, and this was quite curious. We wondered if that was possible to actually preserve these dung fungi out in the marine system, and indeed they are preserved in smaller quantities, but enough to be to give us this kind of record. And again, around 44,000 years ago, based on the chronologies we have, we see this stepwise decline and continuous decline to a lower level of the dung fungi. So these are big changes. What do they mean? Is it reflecting the demise of or the reduction in the numbers of large mammals on the Australian continent at this time of around 40 to 44,000 years ago? Or is there other changes happening that may have generated this response? So this is a kind of summary of all those sites around Australia. You can see even up in the Kimberley, a marine record, Lynch's Crater up in Queensland. There's my cursor here down in Western Australia as well. The one I just mentioned off South Australia, one up in the Victorian Highlands and Lake George here. We're working currently on Lake George again to build that, and we've seen this roughly around that time reduction in dung fungi, all just suggesting that across the Australian continent there seems to be a reduction, certainly in the dung fungi. And if that truly represents animal biomass, then it implies a reduction, and perhaps reduction in the numbers, and perhaps even extinction of some of the megafauna. So archaeologically, this is quite difficult. The numbers of fossil remains are very limited. Paleontologically, even longer terms, they're limited. So we have a small database to deal with, but nevertheless, these patterns are emerging and worth while debating, I think. The curious thing, of course, the yellow dot there is where Majubibi, where this 65,000-year human occupation site is, and that is some 20,000 years or so before this change in the dung fungi or purported megafauna extinction event. And so, what role did human agency perhaps play in that? Is this are those data points even can be contested, of course. So there's debate around the dating as well. There's a range of problems to get through, but it's certainly curious that these independent analyses from a whole different range of ecosystems yield a similar timing of this change. So I don't certainly have the answer, but there are some really interesting work going on at the moment, looking at not just the extinction of megafauna around this time, but the arrival of people into this landscape. Corey Bradshaw and the team recently, I think I can do this, yep, did some modelling of arrival of people into Australia and using sort of ecological human dynamic models, came up with a scenario for occupation from Australia if people arrived into that Kimberley region some 50 to even 75,000 years ago. And it shows essentially under a whole range of assumptions that potentially you can occupy Australia and New Guinea, greater area of Sahel, within about a 6,000 year period, and potentially to a carrying capacity of 6.5 million. So really kind of interesting. Now I'm going to work out how to get back. I'll just stop sharing for a minute, everybody. Sorry about that. Share screen. Here we go. So yeah, I'd encourage you to look at that paper because it generates some interesting ideas. And again, all can be contested and debated, but essentially it still doesn't close that gap of some 20,000 years of people arriving. You'd expect some extinctions to occur perhaps as people arrived 65,000 years ago. We don't tend to see that in the record as yet. So it's a curious problem. Just to throw another spanner in the works, as it were, or an interesting variable. Again, recently, Cooper and Turney and others, and Janelle Stevenson was involved in this paper as well, looked at the representation of this magnetic geomagnetic excursion, the La Champ event, which occurred some 42,000 years ago. And prior to that change of the Earth's magnetic field, there was a period of fairly weakened magnetic field, which potentially, in the dark grey there, represents a time of increased UV radiation, potentially harmful for living organisms on Earth. And there's been speculation in this article, of course, about what that particular event may have caused or influenced in terms of these biological and human activity events that we are thinking about back at this early time frame at around 42,000 years ago. So you see onset of burning in tropical Australia, this megafauna extinction event, and some other changes in the climate system that may have indeed resulted in potentially the leading to more susceptibility of these megafauna to extinction under the influence perhaps of human activity. So it's complex, clearly, but there's some fascinating new data coming out that begins to lend us or help us think about these dynamics in the environment. Let me move forward a little bit in time. Been working a lot over the years on issues around the origins and timing of domestication in Sahel, and particularly in New Guinea. This is a cross-section of the mountains of New Guinea that go up to 5,000 metres above sea level. And the kind of changes that occurred, last glacial maximum, very cold, glaciers, quite widespread, compressed vegetation zones. And then after the last glacial maximum, about 22,000 years ago, we see a period of quite rapid change and essentially reforestation in many ways as we move up the altitudinal slopes of the mountains of New Guinea. And it's within this context that we have been working quite extensively. People like Jack Golston and others, Tim Denham, working in Cook Swamp, and Chris Ballard, of course, working up in a number of regions up there, and myself, of course, working with the palaeoecological reconstruction of this kind of environment, along with Jeff Hope and others. Today I'll just talk briefly about Cook, but I want to introduce a couple of new sites we're working on. Simbai Kairong Valley with Ben Shaw, who's in the audience here, Judith Field from Sydney as well, and in Lake Kootaboo, of course, this remarkable lake that we've been working on in creating some really high resolution records over the last several thousand years. And people like Kelsey Long, who's in the audience, and Larissa Schneider have been critical in developing some of those records as well. All of these lend themselves to this study of human agency in that environment and what role it's played in changing the environments that we see today. And these are those three areas: Cook Swamp, right up in the mountainous region, Simbai-Kaironk region, where Andy Paul and others worked with Siam Manjap and others probably 30 or 40 years ago, but creating beautiful work up there in terms of collaborating with local people and looking at the ethnobotany of that environment and the language of that environment, that region. And Lake Kootaboo, where I've been working down in that southern slopes, where there's quite a significant mining activity going on at the moment. But it's a sago producing region. Cook Swamp, many of you know the story, some at least 7,000 years of wetland agriculture evidence through the archaeology, but also the palaeoecology, and a really wonderful sort of indication of this independent origin of agriculture in the highlands of New Guinea. And this is the kind of records we've been able to produce from there, looking again at this yellow being the sort of open grasslands, green, the forests. You can see as you move up in time towards the present, a significant shift towards a more open environment. And that open environment is the agricultural environment in which people began to develop more and more sophisticated approaches to agricultural production over the last 7,200 years. And one of the key sort of indicators, not just we can do the sort of numerical analysis here and look at not just the kind of presence absence of certain plants, but how rapidly they change. And this rate of change of the vegetation is a really key indicator of the kind of turnover and rate of environmental change that we're experiencing through time, but in particular in the more recent time. This is a really significant sort of notion to get a handle on it and explore in our research. And across the highlands, we see this period from about the last glacial maximum, 24,000 years ago, through to the present represented there. And we see quite in that Pleistocene period a really dynamic climate-driven environment. Climate drivers predominate kind of change we see. But as soon as we get up into this mid to late Holocene, we see that the kind of rates of change aren't synchronous with the rates of change in climate. And this is suggested to be a overprinting of the human influence or human agency in that Holocene period. Not continuous or linear, but certainly perhaps stochastic in nature. And this is the nature of perhaps domestication and changes to landscape. They're not necessarily linear all the time, but have periods of rapid change, and understanding when they occur and why they occur is in many ways key to the research we do. Moving down from the highlands into this sort of lowland area where we don't have the classic root crop, taro, agricultural yams and so on as being the dominant subsistence crops, we move into a space where you've got horticulture or the production of sago in quite large quantities today, and extensive plantations essentially of sago. And I was very interested in the history of this particular environment and was able to visit there a number of times, taking calls from this remarkable lake, Lake Kootaboo, people like Larissa and others from UPNG and local community coming together and looking at the history and the dynamics of these sago plants. And in many ways, they're critical for long-term sustainability of these communities. This area experienced an earthquake when I was just before I went there in 2018, and there was lots of talk about how some of the sago trees had began to tilt and be perhaps may not produce as expected. There's also periods of drought. You're obviously in a swamp, so this is somewhat resilient to drought issues, but certainly drought can play a part in this. So people are intensely aware of these environmental impacts. Alongside that, you've got the increases in population and changes in population dynamics because of the mine, but also over time and migration of people in and out of this area from other parts, all influencing long-term sustainability. And it's such a beautiful place. I just thought I'd play you. This family are harvesting the sago using very traditional approaches, smashing the pith, bring it out of the tree. Apparently he's thinking about how hard the work is. Boy group, Kutubu region, how hard the work is. Basically how the men are pretty lazy and don't help. So it's a universal theme, I think, for everybody. But yeah, a really clearly a big family activity, and one that sustains and produces the food base for that community over many hundreds and perhaps thousands of years. And we're interested in that dynamic and how long this kind of production had gone on around the lake. And here's just one insight into that particular core dated back 5,000 years ago. Certainly sago is present, represented by the little titleist, another kind of remnant, siliceous remnant of a plant that gets preserved in our sediments. And you can see after about 1,500 years ago, there's almost constant and continuous presence of those phytoliths, but also increasing erosion or perhaps disturbance in that environment represented by this thing called magnetic susceptibility. So putting these things together, we get the sense that perhaps 1,500 years ago, there's a intensification of sago production in this basin, and that continues today. And this is an example. I don't want you to read all of that, but it's an example of the kind of different proxies we look at from Kutubu. This is the record back 4,000 years ago, but showing in the last 1,500 years an intensification of sago production, disturbance of the rainforest. That's represented in the rainforest curve there. You can see the higher variability, reduction in rainforest, increase in disturbance factors, increases in charcoal, changes in the water quality. All these things occur when you start to change the mode and tempo and intensity of the production in that landscape. So what we kind of see, I think, is this movement from almost wild production, gathering perhaps in these early to mid-Holocene periods, but a period of low intensity production, but building from about 1,500 years ago through to around 700 years ago. And Bryce Barker and others who've been working in this area from an archaeological point of view start to see these similar patterns emerging as well. So again, we start to build a picture of not just the highlands, which many people think of as the classic agricultural environment, but a different approach to living and subsistence in this lower altitude region. And so yeah, we start, I think, really start to see this strong relationship between sort of agricultural innovation and expansion, contraction and climate change, all coming together to create quite a dynamic landscape, and a landscape that indeed is, even though it's all, if you fly in, it looks like rainforest, untouched rainforest, but in fact, it's deeply embedded in that society and managed and used by the people living in that region. Let's hop over to the other side of the highlands, to the north, Simbai Kaironk, which I mentioned, Andy Pawley and Ralph Bulmer, in collaboration with PNG researchers there, such as Siam Majab, really wonderful researchers, wonderful outcome with these sort of dictionaries that are now available. But today, yes, people are still obviously in growing their sweet potato in particular. You can see those hillsides being cleared, I think, mostly for sweet potato production. and we went there a couple of years ago to try and build a paleoecological story or a record of what's going on in this, again, a different ecology, a different system in New Guinea, and one that has many stories about particularly the arrival of sweet potato from South America. Of course, this Columbian exchange phenomenon is really fascinating, and one that we hope to delve even more into in the future. People like Rebecca Hamilton is particularly interested in that aspect in our lab, and we really hope we can start to get a deeper understanding of the timing and impacts of these kind of changes that occurred perhaps at the margins of the longer term agriculture in the highlands themselves. And this is a kind of first look at the kind of records we're getting out of places like Simbai, Chiron. And these dark patches represent essentially organic sedimentation, and the light patches are inorganic, or what we think it might be erosion occurring. And erosion occurs, of course, most probably as an outcome of forest clearance and perhaps intensification of the agricultural activity. We're also fortunate in New Guinea to have some tephras, volcanic tephras, which enable us to date and finally date the sedimentary sequence along with radiocarbon dating. So we're just beginning really to look at these sequences, and the initial sort of interpretation is that perhaps, you know, a lot of these areas, particularly in the lower parts of the Simbai and Chiron area, much more intensive erosion has occurred in the last 350 years or so, which correlates to when we think sweet potato arrives in Papua New Guinea and then is dispersed, not uniformly, but in some areas taking it up with particular gusto, resulting in not just the arrival of the plant, but perhaps increase in pig populations, but also movements of people into new areas where sweet potato can be grown. And all these factors are likely to be at play here in this region. So it's a wonderful area to kind of study that dynamic. So this notion of rates of community turnover, just in the last sort of section of the talk, we're really looking at it being these global changes occurring with the Anthropocene, onset of the Anthropocene, and climate change phenomenon. And by looking at this notion of the rates of community turnover, we really can start to get a sense of how communities are changing and in what direction. And are they simply bouncing up and then back to what they were before, or are they irreversibly changing to something new and novel? And that's some of what I want to talk about in the last part. And some of us were very fortunate to be part of a big collaborative effort over the last couple of years with Sandra Nogue in Europe, in Spain, and she Southampton University, I think she's based. Simon, is that correct? Yes. Yeah, and so yeah, it was really wonderful to be able to collaborate with these people and bring together the kind of records I've been showing you, which are all individually based, but here's a sort of global meta-analysis, if you like, of some 27 different islands and their records, associated records of pollen and environmental change. And this was published in Science just on the weekend, and it really does show this remarkable shift or accelerated compositional turnover on islands that occurs at or very close to the time soon after when people arrive into that environment. And many of these are really they're not large continental land masses, they're small islands, quite remote, so potentially quite sensitive to a range of impacts, climate as well as human arrival, but overwhelmingly the human signal dominates, and you start to see these changes in the ecosystems. And really in no example do we really see the return to any prior human arrival ecosystem in these records. And you can see this here, the pre-human arrival, the kind of rates of compositional change are very slow. These records date back 3 or 5 to up to 5,000 years before the present. But when people start to arrive in many of these places in the last 3,000 or 1,500, or in some cases quite recently, European expansion into the region, you see this order of magnitude in change, of the rate of change, and the consequences of that are very significant across all these islands, including extinction and restriction of many of the key species that have evolved there over the millions of years. This isn't just a phenomenon that we see played out on small islands, even though they're really wonderful sort of microcosms to study this phenomenon. We see it on large continental scale as well. And this is a case from the Kimberley. We've been working, myself and Sue Rule and Simon Connor and others have been working up there on some records, particularly spanning the last 30,000 years or so, but also focusing in on this very much recent period. Displacement of Aboriginal land tenure and management occurred in this area quite much later than in the southern part of Australia, but it certainly occurred there, equally as devastating, and tragic changes occurred brought by, in this case, the arrival of the cattle industry, and in some cases sheep as well, but cattle dominating this area. And the consequences of that are quite significant in terms of the environmental changes. And some of these changes you might think might have been recorded in the historical record, but in many cases they weren't. And these are kind of forgotten impacts, as it were. So when botanists and others, geographers and so on, go up there to look at that landscape, they see a landscape that is missing certain things, and the explanation is, they perhaps were never here. And so when we did this record, particularly the botanists of that region were very surprised to see that some of these plants, such as some of the riverine plants that were edible, and some of the Banksies and so on, were there only over 100 years ago, but had been removed essentially by the arrival of cattle and changing fire regimes. That's what all those sort of indicators there, different types of indicators, lead to suggest that the arrival of cattle and the changing fire regimes had fundamental consequences on the Kimberley region. So again, this notion of a pristine environment is far from true. And so yeah, another case that's perhaps even closer in time, but we've been very fortunate to be able to work with community, Tasmanian Aboriginal community down on the Bass Strait Islands, particularly in the Furneaux group, Flinders, Cape Barren, Truwana, Clark Island, Lungtalanana, these islands that are today Aboriginal land, as they always have been, but now people have been able to move back there with tenure and are encouraging research and really interested in this longer time frame of change. And so I've been working with the Truwana Rangers and working on country rangers in the other islands of Bass Strait to really bring forward the long-term environmental history. And we've got a great team here, Matthew Adele, who's been doing an amazing work with his PhD, Fairley Hopp, who's been working on some of the longer records as well. Others like Dave Bowman and Dave McWethy been working on some other records in that. So we've got quite a good team, all working with community to bring together this idea of what were these environments like. And they're particularly interesting because these are the environments that were exposed. Just go back there. There's a land bridge essentially between mainland Australia and Tasmania during much of its history, during the glacial period. It's only in the last 8,000 years or so that they've been isolated as islands. And so what has that engendered in terms of the kind of landscapes and changes we might expect in time? And here, Matthew's recently published this paper on the Indigenous fire-managed landscapes of Southeast Australia during the Holocene, but looking at the Furneaux group in particular and showing quite a dynamic and significant changes in the fire regimes through the charcoal records, suggesting that when the landscape was open to walking across, as it were, these landscapes were intensely managed, dynamic and mosaics of vegetation, particularly heath-dominated vegetation, were important components. Land use changed, of course, when sea level rose and perhaps it became less frequent at a minimum, and we see a change in the fire regime along with that. So again, human agency directly impacting upon fire dynamics is one of the key messages that comes out of this. And this is a key message that's the community there are particularly interested in, because they're facing now major issues of managing that landscape through fire and in a time of climate change, and they're incredibly interested in getting scientific as well as cultural insights into how best to manage these environments for the future. And here's the kind of records we were able to generate from just the charcoal particles, and compare them from the mainland to the Furneaux Island group, and then onto the mainland of Tasmania. And you can see quite different things going on. So it's very much a space in which we're looking for evidence, for how different landscapes are affected by these climate and cultural changes. Just finally, we're starting to expand out into some of the different environments in Tasmania and the small islands as well. And in this one particular case, this was brought about by interest from the national parks community. And this is a beautiful landscape. If anybody's had the opportunity to walk the 3 Cape walk in Tasmania, quite remote, difficult, isolated kind of cliff top landscape. But again, this has a fire history. It has a long Indigenous history, and it is now subject to climate change, and national park managers and traditional owners in this region are very interested in, what the potential changes in the future might be and how stable this environment is. We went there a month ago, and we're able to, again, Matthew's worked on developing this pollen record from some of the small ponds in this beautiful environment, and has shown that, again, since European arrival, displacement of Aboriginal land tenure and management, in this case occurring over 200 years ago, you see really significant transformations that have this origin in that early events. Increased burning, resulting in a shift from what was probably a very diverse heathland through to a much more thick and, in some cases, impenetrable shrub of some of the melaleucas and so on. This is kind of information that when you walk there, you would have no idea about or concept of those sort of quite relatively recent changes that have transformed this national park environment. So over this talk, I've tried to give you a sense of the different timescales, the kind of time depth we're dealing with in our work. But really, it begins to highlight that in our region, there are these really key times of environmental change brought about by, I think in the bold there, those 65,000 years ago, 41, 7,000, these are the ones I've spoken about, 7,000, 1,500 to around 200, 230 years ago. These are, in many cases, human-dominated changes through, you could argue, with our interpretation, but of course there are other tipping points and changes in environment, such as the last glacial maximum, the 14,700s, moving out of the glacial period, lots of change going on as the planet warms up into the Holocene around 11,700 years ago. Changes in the Pacific Ocean and ENSO variability, perhaps around 4,500 years ago. These may well be climate driven, but whatever the cause of these increased rates of change or tipping points in the environment, these are clearly fundamentally transformative periods in this landscape's long history. And with people living in this environment, of course, they would have experienced those changes and the implications of that for cultural dynamics, linguistics, all those interesting aspects we're trying to think about here in the Evolution of Cultural Diversity Initiative, potentially tie points to really grapple with and start to explore, not just in the Sahulian region, but out into the Pacific as well. So yeah, I guess this reading landscapes notion as a, through a paleoecological lens is a way of perhaps revealing some of these hidden histories, the ones that are preserved in these deposits that we perhaps walk around and view unawares, but within that you have this remarkable archive of our environmental and human history in those deposits. And in some ways it's this window into the landscapes of the past of not just the climate, but the people. In the early periods, I guess, have not only been made by those landscapes, but are now indelibly and irreversibly making the landscapes of tomorrow. And just to finish, I guess, not in answer to Kim's question about what is this thing called transdisciplinarity, but again, back to Glacken notion. This is a little quote from the book. A historian of geographic ideas who stays within the limits of their discipline sips on a thin gruel, which I love the notion of that, sipping on a thin gruel, because these ideas are almost invariably derived from broader inquiries. Of necessity, they are spread widely over many areas of thought. And I think that's the essence of the kind of work we want to do here in this initiative, but also in CHL more broadly, where many people have the opportunity, I think, to sip on a thicker gruel in this environment and really build a strong interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary, perhaps, environment into the future. And just to finish, I've got many acknowledgements. I'm in a wonderful group, the Archaeology and Natural History group, PaleoWorks Lab, really excellent people to work with. But overall, this talk has encompassed so many communities around New Guinea and Australia and Tasmania. It's, the list is long, and the list is really significant in terms of the, as I mentioned, the generosity and interest and great collaborations that we've been able to build over this research. And I really look forward to continuing that. So thank you.